my best to make this entertaining. I'm also going to warn you, I'm 8-hour time difference, so a little bit jet lag. I hope my brain's going to be full functioning here. I'm going to present the optimistic perspective of a project developer. 500 million hectares. That's the area of land available worldwide, I'm told, that's available for reforestation. This matters because it's the greatest opportunity we have to actually remove carbon from the air. But dream with me for a moment. How would we go about realistically trying to reforest 500 million hectares? Is buying all the land for timber investments the only way? My name's Khalil Baker. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Taken Root, and today I'm going to share with you a different perspective. A perspective of how we might go about complementing that by working in partnership with the hundreds of millions of people that already manage that land through what I call a decentralized reforestation model. But in many ways, this is also a little bit of my life story, so it's going to get a bit personal. For me, it started about 20 years ago. At the time, I was working in Nicaragua, trying to convince landowners that they should reforest portions of their land in exchange for carbon payments as the trees grow over time. The challenge was that most people didn't even know that trees remove carbon, let alone what carbon was. So needless to say, I wasn't very successful at first. But out of that, what I did get out of that experience is I stumbled upon a question that ultimately ended up changing the course of my life. It's a question I started obsessing over. I kept on asking myself over and over. And I was a dropout and ended up going back to university to ultimately do a PhD to try and answer this question. And it's a question that I realize is critical for the successful development of reforestation projects, at least in the decentralized way, but so few people seem to ever ask. And it's a question that I hope by the end of this presentation, many of you will start asking yourselves when you're considering the design or investment in a high-integrity forest carbon project. Here's the question. And the question is this. Why do some people choose to grow trees on their land while others don't? If you look at this picture, for example, these two parcels look more or less identical, but one of them's covered in trees and the other one isn't. Why did one landowner choose to do it that way and the other one didn't? They're in the same climate. Soil conditions are probably similar. Market conditions are probably similar. Everything's the same, except for one's growing trees and one isn't. Why is that? You might ask yourself, who cares? Why does this matter? But this matters because most of the land available for reforestation worldwide takes place in patchwork landscapes, just like this one. And so it's the biggest opportunity that we have, but this land is managed by millions and millions of different people. So if we really want to design programs, sorry, I don't know what is happening. If we really want to design programs, national scale programs, then we need to go deep into understanding this question. Sorry. As I said, the jet lag, got to get my mind back into it. But the crazy thing to me is that so few people seem to be asking themselves this very question when they're designing projects. Not only can this lead to failed projects, it can lead to a lack of credibility and the lack of the belief in the potential of natural climate solutions. So today, I'd like to offer 3 simple insights for designing great projects. Insights that I've developed over the last 15 years working in this space. I've been involved in designing projects working with local communities across Africa and Latin America. And I've seen, I hate to say, a lot of failures, a lot of projects that didn't work out very well. In fact, most of the projects I've seen didn't work out that well, even when they're really well funded, and even when they're developed by really reputable project developers. But in a few cases, it has worked out. Like, for example, the project in Nicaragua I mentioned earlier is now the largest reforestation initiative in the whole country. And it's still doing this. It's the largest reforestation initiative in the whole country. And it's working with thousands and thousands of little small landowners. And this model is now starting to be exported into other countries. I've seen some good, I've seen some bad, and I hope to share some of these experiences with you so we can help work to accelerate the restoration of the world's forests. So insight number 1, ask people what they want to do and why. I realize it sounds like such a basic question, but so few people seem to ask this question, or at least well. And I don't mean like a basic FPIC kind of way, where you ask people once you've already designed the project, tick a box, and say it's done. I mean when you meaningfully consult before you've even designed the project, so you can understand if people want to grow trees at all, and if so, how. At the end of the day, this is just basic market research. If you're trying to get widespread adoption into the program, there's no better way of asking people what they want and why. And I don't mean like asking for all the details. I mean like the big picture question. And it doesn't take long usually for some big trends to emerge. For example, people in coffee producing regions, if they want to grow trees, it tends to be in agroforestry systems or coffee agroforestry systems. People who earn their livelihood through cattle tend to be interested in growing trees through silvopastoral systems. So that's the combination of growing trees with cattle. Or in agricultural regions or crop-producing regions, people tend to want to grow high-valued species on the parts of their farm that aren't suitable for agriculture. But what's really interesting is when you start asking people why they want what they want. That's where a lot of the richness comes out. In some cases, it's tied to people's identity. Someone will say with pride, you know, I'm a third-generation coffee farmer. I was born a coffee farmer. I'm going to die a coffee farmer. And things like that aren't easy to change. But a lot of the times, it's way more circumstantial, and people will happily try new things if it improves their livelihoods. I'm going to give you examples from some of my experience in Nicaragua. Over there, most farmers they grow corn, they grow beans, and they grow multi-purpose cattle. Now, a farmer who has about 3 hectares of land will commonly do about 1 or 2 hectares of growing corn and beans, and on the 3rd hectare, they'll have a cow or 2. But a farmer that's got a 50-hectare parcel will also just do 1 or 2 hectares usually of corn and beans and use the rest for cattle. But what's interesting is, do you know why people like cattle? In that part of the world, a lot of the times, people like cattle because it's not really labor intensive. When they're growing that 1 or 2 hectares of bean and corn, it ends up using the entire labor supply of that household. And so at the end of the day, there's not much available resources left for the rest of the land. And so if they can get some hands on cattle, they'll be very extensive and they'll just kind of roam around. But people happily raise the same amount of cattle on less land, more intensively, if they can get the investment and know-how needed to make this happen. So these are some real opportunities. My clicker clicks by itself. It just gets you like it wants me to speak faster. The second insight is ask people what's stopping them from realizing their dreams. Ultimately, if there's a gap between what people say they want and what they're really doing, there has to be a reason, right? And those reasons are what we call barriers. And project design is really about removing those barriers. Removing those barriers to help people change that mental calculus for why they're going to use the land the way that they want to use that land. What's challenging about finding out about barriers is it's not as straightforward. It's not that people are lying, but when you ask them, they end up being so many different reasons. The reasons that, in fact, tend to be endless. Like, I do it, but there's this other thing. And that's when we like to ask, well, if that other thing was resolved, then would you be interested? Which people answer, well, yeah, well, there's also this other thing. And you ask again, well, if that was resolved, then would you be interested? And you keep going down that line of thought until you end up getting to like the core reasons. Ultimately, we're looking for like 1 to 3 core barriers. These are the core reasons that's stopping people from doing this in the first place. And ultimately, it's a lot easier to design a really good project around just 1 or just a few barriers than trying to fix everything under the sun. No. I'm going to try and give you an example to make this a little more concrete. We were recently setting up a project in the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic is the world's largest exporter of organic cacao. In that part of the region, part of the world, almost all the cacao is grown under the shade of trees and agroforestry systems. So we went and we asked people, would folks be interested in growing more cacao? And there's a resounding answer from the community. It was like, yeah, absolutely. And then we asked people, well, why aren't you already growing more cacao? To which people said, well, there's all sorts of reasons, like the price of cacao is too low. Or, well, the price of cacao might be okay, but intermediaries take these really big commissions, so we don't make enough money from growing more cacao. Or our productivity or yields are too low. But then we ask them, well, if all these things are true, why are you growing cacao at all? So obviously, this wasn't the core barrier of why people weren't doing it. And so upon digging further, what we realized is that the real problem was that, again, labor supply was an issue. Folks were growing cacao, and that took up all the available labor that they had. And starting new cacao plantations was super labor intensive, and they didn't have access to investment or cash savings to be able to make those investments. So now we're designing a project in the Dominican Republic around removing the barrier of making sure cash is available earlier on to be able to set up new agroforestry plantations. And the third insight is that technology is needed to support growing trees at scale, especially for these decentralized models. In other words, these barriers are complicated to overcome, and tech, I think, can play a really important role. A lot of people seem to think that the problem is just a question of having to grow more trees or just measure the carbon. And so when they think of technological solutions, they think of things like drones that can plant trees at lower cost, right? Or measure the carbon at a lower cost. But the real problem is that in many cases, people don't want to grow trees there in the first place. Or said differently, they'd rather something else more, given the current set of barriers. So our job is to design programs that remove those barriers to help change that mental calculus. The challenge is that removing those barriers can be incredibly complicated when there's so many, and especially when you're working with so many people. So my view of it is we got to find ways of using technology to help overcome those barriers and making it accessible to the folks on the ground who are closest to working with growing the trees. Just because through these decentralized models, when you're working with a large number of people, you have to do many of the same things as through a more centralized model, right? You still need to find people, you need to find land, you need to assess its suitability for growing trees, you need to make sure it wasn't recently deforested, you still need to coordinate the nurseries, the planting of the trees, you still need to measure the carbon and manage for performance. But in addition to that, you have to create the right financial incentives at the right time to help overcome the barriers that were stopping people to do this in the first place. Fact of the matter is, I don't know how you would do all of this cost effectively without the use of technology. So I thought I can give you another example from our own experience of what this looks like to make it a little bit more tangible. In the projects that we work with, we employ a lot of extension agents. Extension agents are just employees of the program whose job is to liaise, work with farmers to help them overcome those barriers. And we use a software platform. We use a software platform that people have on their phones to help them track everything that they do. Everything from like mapping the parcels, creating the shape files, assessing for deforestation, tracking every visit. It's a little bit how like FedEx might track every parcel that goes through their system. In our case, it's very similar, except for the parcel doesn't move, right? The parcel is a piece of land that stays fixed, but we track the movement of people, trees, and the progress in their growth over time. And we were facing this problem. The problem was that we had these two groups of parcels. The first group, the trees were growing really well. It was affordable to be able to establish them and get them to grow. Then we had this second group of parcels where performance was quite low. Mortality was really high, and we kept having to go to replant. And we were having a hard time trying to predict what led to a parcel being a high-performing parcel and a low-performing parcel. And so when we're going through the data, what we realized was that the high-performing parcels tend to be ones that were planted a lot earlier than the low-performing parcels. In that part of the world, there's about 6 months of a rainy season. And so you basically got like a 6-month growing season, followed by a 6 month where the trees don't really grow. And so if a tree was planted earlier in the season, it got the 6 months to grow. But if it was planted in the 5th month, it only had 1 month to grow. Now, I realize this is super obvious, right? Like when you say it this way, but when you're managing a program with so many parcels at such a national scale, these kinds of insights can be really difficult to come by. And so now a lot of the performance management of this program is really optimized to making sure that farmer recruitment in nurseries take place as early as possible in the season so that they get as much time to grow. And so to summarize, why do these 3 insights matter? First, they matter for scale. Inevitably, when you work with a bunch of farmers like this, you inevitably end up working with a lot smaller parcel sizes. And we don't do this because we think small is beautiful. We do this because most of the land available for restoration worldwide is managed by millions of different people. So ultimately, if you want to do things at scale, you have to do programs that are able to access so many people. And for these decentralized models to work, you really have to start changing the mental calculus people face and addressing those barriers. But when you start doing this, when you start designing programs, national scale programs that really address the needs of what people want, I think what you end up with is something incredible. You end up with the backbone of what I think creates some of the highest integrity carbon removals out there. So this brings me to quality. This is also really critical for quality. When you work with so many different people over such a landscape, this plays an important role in what some people call permanence or durability. Ultimately, when the carbon investment is spread over thousands and thousands and thousands of parcels over an entire country, it's really, really diversified. It's really hard for something to come in and destroy all of it. As in forest fires will come in, that happens. Landowners will change their mind and clear that land. But as a percentage of the whole, these are much smaller numbers, and so that risk is really diversified. The second thing it does is that people are really bought into the program. When you design a program that meets people's needs and helps improve their livelihoods, they take care of it. A little bit like how you can rely on a business owner to not sabotage their own business, usually. Farmers do the same thing. Another reason why this creates a really high quality model is that these projects really are additional. Ultimately, they're designed to overcome barriers, to find real solutions to real problems, and so this really allows you to make something happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise, because it completely depends on this for it to happen. It also creates an amazing environmental outcome. Not only do you remove vast amounts of carbon from the air, farmers almost always choose native species over exotics. They all tend to grow trees in a much more diverse land set, so you end up with greater diversity of native tree species. And then finally, it matters from the social impact perspective. In our industry, a lot of people call this social co-benefits of the carbon, but the fact of the matter is, I kind of think that's the complete wrong way to look at it. I've never met a farmer who told me that the reason why they grow trees on their land is to optimize the carbon that they sequestered. But I have met a lot of farmers who choose to grow trees in different ways to improve their livelihoods. So I hope because of this talk, the next time that next time you're involved in investing or designing a forest carbon project, I hope you ask yourself the very question: why do some people choose to grow trees on their land when others don't? And when you do, when you work backwards from that question, you just might realize, like I have, that we need to be designing projects that recognize that carbon is the co-benefit, not the other way around. This is the end of my general talk, but I realize I didn't tell you very much about taking root, although I'm sure you're able to put a lot of it together. We're a purpose-driven company that works to grow trees and sell the resulting carbon removals around the world. We've been doing this for 15 years, and our flagship project is in Nicaragua, where it started off quite small and is now the largest restoration initiative in the entire country, possibly all of Central America. And we work with thousands of different landowners, and so ultimately working with quite small parcel sizes. Of course, to be able to manage forest carbon projects on so many different parcels of land, a big part of what we do is also develop a technology software to help lower those costs, to be able to create carbon removals cost effectively while working with so many different landowners. We're based in Vancouver, Canada. This explains with the jet lag. We're a team of 40 people at the headquarter level. And at the project level, we have a couple hundred employees and then create thousands of jobs seasonally. And we're now looking to take what we've learned and export it to new geographies. And so we're in fact looking for financial partners at this time to help us do that. Don't want to keep people much longer before the drinks, but I'm happy to take a couple of questions if there are any.
Thanks for the presentation. Andrew Gaines from Carbon Ventures Africa. Yeah, I'm a project developer as well, reforestation in the southern part of DRC, the Congo. It's actually an interesting geography because there's very large areas of land with low population density, so we have 300-400 families on up to 50,000 hectares of land. You have a lot more experience than I do in this. We've been doing it for a couple of years now, but I'd be interested in your take on a situation where you run into more labor constraints than anything because there's such large areas of land that the local communities want to reforest, but obviously the labor availability is not there. So what would your tips be on that and a general advice on larger areas of land with smaller numbers of people that live on that land?
Yeah, great question. I mean, first to say, I think the characteristics you're describing are really, really good for forest carbon projects. Generally speaking, if there's a much lower population density and the land's not like prime agricultural land, tends to lend itself a lot better to this. So in one way, and from one sense, I think that's a really privileged perspective we work for. And in fact, when we look for projects, that's some of the key criteria that we look for. If you're doing a model that involves like planting the trees, especially in the beginning, that can be super labor intensive. And so if labor is scarce, then that becomes, sounds like a real bottleneck. And we have faced similar things at different areas. I think the answer is always going to be a little bit context specific, but I'll maybe give you a couple of examples of ways that we've addressed it. In one ways, depending on what the drivers of deforestation are or preventing land to regenerate naturally, natural regeneration is often a really good way to go, or assisted natural regeneration. You need the right characteristics, but that's one way that you can greatly reduce the amount of labor involved. And in fact, nature tends to, in the right circumstances, regenerate much more productively with greater diversity. Sometimes it just needs a bit of assistance to get that going. The other models that we sometimes use is when we're at labor scarcity, we sometimes involve the coordination of moving of labor from one area to another for a temporary period to do the work. I presented these as two options, but I think they're not mutually exclusive. You can integrate natural regeneration, and sometimes it just becomes more of enrichment planting. So you've reduced your labor requirements, and then bring in excess labor from somewhere else to be able to complement it.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. I'm Shauna from the Forest Link, and I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit about how these farmers are paid, both in terms from proceeds from the carbon credit sales and also maybe other revenue generation that happens from these land use activities.
Yeah, so like, again, project specific, I think it's really about understanding the barriers of the context. I can speak to a couple of examples of where we work in. A lot of our stuff, we literally do direct cash payments based on performance milestones. And so, for example, we'll have like, okay, we'll start off with the planting design. You want to hit a certain density. And once we verify that that density has been hit, there's a direct cash payment. Next milestone might be getting out of the stage we call like non-vulnerable. So you get a minimum height of the trees and at a certain minimum density. And you go, okay, now things are pretty good kind of thing. And so you create these critical management milestones, and we give cash payments. In our model, we've given 60% of the carbon sale price directly through payments to the community. But it's not that cash payments is the only way, and sometimes that's not a desirable way, and I think it really depends on the context and structure of the project. So the one I mentioned in the Dominican Republic, in this case, there's a lot of reluctance to do direct cash payments. And I say direct cash payments, they're usually done by checks or cash transfers. We're not actually carrying big piles of cash. But sometimes there's some reluctance for using this type of incentives. And so in that case, instead of paying necessarily direct cash payments, we'll cover part of it is like the cost of labor. So in that case, that was a real constraint. And so we can hire labor and bring that in, and that minimizes certain dangers, some risks in that area. Oh, and then lastly, at least in our model, we don't take ownership in the land, and we don't take ownership either in the trees or the goods that they produce. But we see it as critical to the development of the model, because ultimately, like going back to why do some people grow trees on the land and others don't, it's really important that it's a win-win, as it's creating a local economy and creates benefit to the landowners.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I thought it was great. My name's Tessa. I'm from Blue Forest, and I was curious if and how speaking of co-benefits, how you assess and track your projects to ensure that the focus on carbon doesn't detract from biodiversity or habitat diversity in these landscapes.
As I was sort of saying in the presentation, I think a really good project is one where co-benefits aren't co-benefits, but core benefits. I really believe that the way people tend to, the land use decisions people make is guided by a certain North Star, and that North Star is usually some form of improving, making a better life for themselves. And so for a project to really be successful, and I think someone was talking about this on the DFI panel, that, if you will, financial sustainability is critical for it. And so if it's a quote-unquote profitable model for the landowner, they're a lot more bought in, and by creating value, then you're creating a lot of these economic benefits or social co-benefits from the process. And of course, part of the selection process of when you select areas to work is you want to make sure you're working in degraded lands. So like, generally speaking, starting from a very, very low biodiversity baseline and then bringing it up. And then from an environmentalist perspective, as I was saying as well, when we go through a process of like asking people what they want, it's kind of been shown and it's been read in the literature. It's my own experience, so is I've read it in literature. People tend to choose tree species that they're familiar with from their region, and they tend to like a diversity of things. And so in our project, for example, we have in Nicaragua, we have over 120 different tree species. We're not managing nurseries for 120 different species, but integrating the combination of natural regeneration and doing things in function of what people are looking for, you end up with this like much greater diversity, which ultimately creates habitat, and then so on and so forth.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name is Phil Skinner from the Private Infrastructure Development Group, and we're hoping to be an investor into this space. I really, really liked and appreciated your focus on the community. What we've observed of this sector is a strong focus on the integrity of the carbon credit, but you've come at this from, community first, at least in your presentation, which I really appreciated. From an investor perspective, though, one of the questions that we're asking is, well, what are the standards that we've been talking about, CCP and the like? But from a social perspective, are there particular standards that you would highlight, having been operating in this space for some time, that the investor community should be looking at in particular?
Yeah, there's so many dimensions of way to answer that question. Maybe I'll start by an anecdote and then try and answer it more directly. Our largest buyer is Microsoft. When they went through their due diligence, and they did some pretty extensive due diligence, like some more due diligence than any buyer we've ever went through, and frankly, in some ways, it feels like they went through more due diligence than the carbon standards went through. And a big focus of theirs was exactly on the community side, and they sent teams of people literally out into the field, interview farmers, like they were really looked into it, and ultimately, that was one of the key criteria that they were looking for, because they were concerned for projects around carbon projects displacing local peoples, et cetera, and having reputational risk associated with it. So that is like the core thing that they went to. They didn't take, we'd use for that project the Plan Vivo standard, which is one that's entirely focused on from the farmer perspective, but they didn't care, honestly. Like, they didn't take the word of the standard for it. They wanted to do their own due diligence. Some standards like Plan Vivo put that at the core of their emphasis, but you should do it and can do it with any carbon standard. And like with the emergence of like this, what we've been calling the carbon market 2.0, I think there's a real convergence around like what are the elements that create a high integrity carbon removal, and these same social criteria are always part of it. My only point is that they should not be viewed as a co-benefit, but a core benefit, and the outcome is carbon. Because if you optimize for carbon, you don't end up doing the right thing on the ground. If you don't do the right thing on the ground, it ends up not working in the long run, you don't get the carbon you wanted. So focus on the core benefit, and carbon will follow. A very passionate perspective.
Sorry, very simple question. But how did the community respond to the Microsoft teams crawling all over the enterprise?
Well, I should say Microsoft didn't go themselves. They hired local teams, and so in this case, the auditing was done by a local university. How does the local team respond? I mean, favorably in every way. Like, in the areas that we work, I can't overemphasize, people are quite happy to receive an extra source of cash income. And recognize the importance of like the credibility of the system, and so overall it's not an obstacle. Inevitably, we go about it with like a good degree of tact, right? And so like we accompany our teams and accompany them and introduce it, and so like soft introductions, so it doesn't feel like an invasion or an audit kind of thing. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, everyone.